Hello everyone, Miss Gretchen here again for yet another writing exercise video. If you missed my first one, don't worry, you can find it on our Facebook page or Instagram, wherever you are. Just scroll back. It's there. I've only done one so far, and that one was starting stories, and hopefully that helped you get started on one or more stories. But maybe you've been working on that story, maybe you haven't, but either way, since I did a video on starting stories, I figured I might as well do one on ending stories, since ending a story can sometimes be as hard, if not harder, than starting one. So first I'm going to go over 5 different ways that you can end a story. They're certainly not the only ways that you can end a story, but there are 5 different processes that you can use when it comes about thinking about how you want to end your story. And each one of them is a little bit different, and one of them will probably fit the tone of your story better than one of the others. But we'll go over all of them first. I'm gonna write them down. Hang on. Okay, so here's how these endings work as an example. My favorite generic example to use in class is a story of 2 friends, Bert and Ernie, who are on an adventure to defeat their rival, Oscar. I use these names to be generic examples in class all the time. And so we're going to pretend that Bert is the main character of our story. He's working with his best friend Ernie to defeat a villain, Oscar, and these are some different ways that we could end their story. So for example, number 1 is surprise. This is that kind of twist ending that you often get, especially at the end of books that are going to go on to be a series or are going to lead into another book or another story. And that can be something like, maybe Bert and Ernie have been working together this whole time, but come to find out, surprise, Ernie's actually working for Oscar. And so now Bert has to defeat both his rival and his best friend, or some other twist ending. There are a lot of those. The second way is emotional. This is also known as the fade out, and I'm sure you can just think of a movie where, it's gray, it's misty, they're probably at a graveyard, they're crying, there's a lot of black umbrellas, and there's just like that fade out as the story or movie ends on like a tear-stained face or something. Doesn't have to be, emotional that way. It can also be emotional happy. Someone has finally made it back to their loved one. So 2 different ways to think about this. Bert and Ernie. What if Ernie dies? What if that's the price for defeating Oscar and the end of your story is at the graveyard, that fade out? Or Bert and Ernie have been separated in their fight for Oscar and they both think that the other are dead. But come to find out, after Oscar is defeated, they find each other again, and there's that moment where they come back together and, hugging, laughter, whatever it is, and leaving your reader with some kind of like big emotional impact. Happy, sad, something in between. Maybe you can figure out something else. Number 3 is punchline. I am not going to give you an example of this one because every time I think up a joke on the fly that I think is funny, it's not that funny. But punchline is what it sounds like. It's lending humor to the end of your story in such a way that it literally ends on a joke. And so if you've been writing a humorous story, this might be the way that you try to end it. If you're writing a kind of sad story or serious story, maybe not, unless there's a character who you've added to add that humor. But if you can figure out a really good joke to end your story on, you're better than me, because it doesn't work out for me most of the time. Number 4 is suspenseful, and this is also known as the open-ended ending. So, Bert and Ernie have done their job, they've defeated Oscar, but they have these open-ended questions. Like maybe they think they defeated Oscar, but Oscar's nowhere to be found. He's just disappeared. So you kind of have to wonder, like, is Oscar still out there? Is he gonna come back, or did they actually defeat him? So leaving these open-ended questions And this sounds like it might be, again, an ending of a story that's going to become another book or another story, but actually a suspenseful ending is a really great way to actually end a story if you're writing a horror story or a mystery story or something with a lot of tension, just to leave the reader thinking after it ends. So don't think that this ending is just for books or stories that go on to have another follow-up. It can be a really, really mean to the reader ending that just makes them think and wonder and, just gnashing their teeth trying to think about what's going to happen. 5 is a little bit more complicated, and it's the repeated theme, and it's also known as the bookend ending. And you know how bookends are normally two of the same thing holding your books together, right? So book-ended ending has to also happen in the beginning of your story. So say at the beginning of Ernie and Bert's journey, they're sitting in a coffee shop, and that's where your story opens, and they're laughing, they're having a good time, they're acting like best friends are, and then the end of your story sees them back there after they've defeated Oscar. They're back in this coffee shop. And the purpose normally of a bookended or repeated theme ending is to show what has happened in the middle of your story. So say, if maybe Bert and Ernie are sitting in that coffee shop and they're not really friends, and it's really awkward and awful, and you can tell that they don't really get along, but after they've worked together to defeat Oscar, they're back in that coffee shop and they're laughing and they've really just become friends. Or otherwise, Bert and Ernie start off in the coffee shop, they're laughing, they're having a good time, life is really easy and light, but after all their adventures, they come back to the coffee shop and they're quieter and they've learned a lot after having gone through all these adventures. So that's something that you have to think about if you want to use that ending. You have to put it at the beginning of your story as well, or otherwise it doesn't work as well. Or it doesn't work at all. It's entirely lost its purpose. So those are 5 different kinds of endings: surprise, emotional, punchline, suspenseful, and repeated theme, that you can think about when you go to end your story. Which one of these tones do you want to set? Because the ending of a story is the last thing the reader reads, right? So that's their lasting impression of the story. So which one of these is going to pack the biggest punch? Which one of these fits your story the best? And when you break it down to 5 categories like this, you can normally tell, well, if I've written a happy story, might not want to have, a suspenseful or a sad ending, for example, or vice versa. So think about these categories, think about how you could end your story and which one matches it the best. So now for a writing prompt. I am going to write some sentences here on the board, and I'll also read them to you. And you're going to use them for a writing exercise. And this one is really nefarious. And so either get a piece of paper or a Word document, however it is that you write. And what you're going to do is after I put the sentences up, choose one and put that sentence either at the bottom of the paper that you're writing on or at the bottom of the Word document that you are using. And why we do that, I will explain to you, but let me get your choices up on the board first. Okay, so I've put 3 options up here, but I have also linked below the video to the website that I got these from, and they have a bunch of other options that you could potentially choose from if you don't like any of these. But put that aside and pick one of these, and like I said, put it either at the bottom of the paper that you're using or at the bottom of the Word document that you're doing, because here's what you're going to do. You're going to choose one of these, and you're going to write the story that ends that way. So your story should end with 1, it had all been worth it. At least that was something. Or, the door still creaked. She no longer cared. They had saved her. Or, he had no need of news now. He knew what was happening. So those are the last 2 or 3 lines of your story, and you have to write down to those words. You can always write more than a page or 1 page of your Word document, but putting it at the bottom just reminds you that you are trying to write a scene that ends this way. And sometimes that's really complicated, but don't forget, these endings give you some clues of what to work with. So for example, you know that there is a she in this one. You know there's a he in this one. You know that for number 1, something has to have been worth it. For number 2, this main character has been saved by a they of some kind. And number 3, this person seems to have been depending on news. Now he isn't, because he has discovered some kind of information that has told him what's happening. So you have some information to work with. You get to make up the rest, and you get to write that scene. Don't get bogged down in trying to figure out what the whole story was unless you're really, really inspired, but just try to think, what is this scene at the end, and write that. So maybe that worked for you, maybe it didn't. But one awesome thing you can always do with stories, exercises like this, and also with the story starter exercise that we worked on last week, is you can totally flip it around. So for another writing exercise, if you couldn't figure out what story ends this way, what if you try to write the story that begins this way? So completely flip it on its head. And what is the story that starts with one of these? And that can be really, really interesting. If you do it with your own work, it can also help to show you what you've left unresolved in your story. So for example, if you use 1 and you write, it had all been worth it, at least that was something, and that's how your story ends. And you can't write anything past that, then you know the whole story is pretty well contained. If you write an ending and you can keep going past it, why have you ended the story there? And maybe it's because the only thing left in your story that's unresolved is a bunch of little things that nobody really cares about, or maybe there's something with a character or a process that has been left unresolved. But for the sake of fun, take one of these things that you've just been considering endings of stories and write the story that happens after the end. And like I said, you can do that with any kind of writing exercise that gives you a sentence. It's a really interesting mental acrobatic exercise to think about it both as the beginning and an end of a story. So hopefully that gives you some ways to think about endings and consider ways of ending your stories. Or, you know, maybe it just helped pass some time in quarantine. Either way, I'll be back next week with another lesson, which will not have to do with starting or ending stories, but will be about writing bits of stories. What will the lesson be, you ask? I know, but you'll have to step back next week to find out. So I will see you then. And until that time, from me and all the other librarians and staff of the Westfield Athenaeum, we miss you very much. We hope that you're doing well, and I can't wait to see you in the future.